Listen close. Whatever you think you know about this, it's wrong. This thing is dangerous.
Would you believe there is a creature that can bind up a deer's wound with grass woven into the shape of a heart? That a wounded deer once stood on a forest porch, and the next morning, its leg was wrapped with braided grass in the shape of a heart. This is the true story of Grace Marlowe, a 37-year-old former Gulf War soldier turned forest ranger who sought solitude in the misty mountains of Idaho, only to be saved not by a person, but by something ancient, something watching, something remembering. They called it a monster. But the truth is, not everything we fear is dangerous, and not everything that protects us wears a uniform. In the shadows of Alder Creek, one being has waited, not to harm, but to help. When Grace knocked 3 times, the forest knocked back, and nothing was ever the same. Through whispers in the rain, footprints in the mud, and a child found safe in a cave wrapped in leaves. This is more than a mystery. It's a story of forgiveness, quiet miracles, and an invisible bond between protector and protected. And now, we want to share it with you. Where are you watching this from? And how far can this story travel? If you believe it deserves to be heard, if your heart stirred even just a little, we invite you to like this video, subscribe, and join our growing community of believers, wanderers, and quiet Bigfoot lovers. From our forest to yours. Thank you for being here. The wind came in waves that night, sifting through the thinning branches of larch and aspen, their golden leaves whispering across the porch of the old ranger cabin like ghosts that had nowhere else to go. Early fall in Alder Creek always brought that quiet kind of unease, the kind that hung just under the sound of the breeze, the kind that made dogs bark at nothing and made Grace Marlowe lock her door 3 times instead of 2. Out there in the northern mountains of Idaho, time didn't pass so much as settle, like dust on an unused road. Grace stood at her kitchen sink, fingers resting on the rim of a chipped enamel mug, watching the rain form tight silver strings under the gutter. The radio on the counter crackled like it was coughing something up from the 1950s. Every so often it gave a burst of static, then died back down. It had been like that since the thunderheads rolled in. She didn't bother fixing it. There wasn't anyone out there worth listening to anyway. She'd been in this cabin 6 years, ever since she left Boise behind after the war. The medals were in a drawer, the papers in a box. But the things that stuck, the things that followed, couldn't be boxed away. Muscle memory kept her checking the locks. Certain sounds made her flinch, and that ache in her ribs some nights, that wasn't from shrapnel. That was just silence. She took her coat down from the hook, slid it on, and stepped out into the dark. The forest greeted her not with menace, but indifference. She preferred that. At least the trees didn't ask questions. The storm was high and slow, a wet, heavy thing that clung to the mountain's shoulders. Grace didn't plan to go far, just around the bend, down by the creek where the water picked up speed after rain. But halfway down the ridge, she stopped. Something low and deep sounded in the distance. 3 thuds, deliberate, spaced like the ticking of a slow, heavy clock. Not thunder, not a branch snapping, not natural. She turned toward it. Nothing moved in the dark. Just wind pushing past pines, sliding across wet bark. She stood there a long moment, then told herself it was just rocks falling, maybe a deer knocking loose a log. Her voice in her own head was calm, practiced. She walked back to the cabin. That night sleep came like it always did, slow, reluctant, and dreamless. But somewhere past midnight, when the fire had burned low and the wind softened to a hush, the sound came again. 3 knocks, far off. Then silence. The next morning, the world looked harmless again. Sunlight burned off the mist. The trees stood quiet and clean. But Grace didn't trust it. She packed her gear and walked out early, heading north through the aspen line, following instinct more than any plan. She found the first sign near a broken fence post. Bark stripped clean. A long smear of dried blood arcing across the side like a paintbrush dipped too deep. Below it, a footprint, if you could call it that. Twice the size of her own boot, splayed wide, toes deep in the earth. Whatever it wasn't running. It was walking. Toward the canyon. Grace knelt, took a breath, and ran her fingers along the edge of the print. Still soft. Less than 24 hours. She looked up toward the trees and didn't say a word. Back at the cabin, she dug out the old cassette recorder from a milk crate in the storage shed. It still worked. She hadn't used it since her first year in the field. She rewound an old tape, pressed record, and waited. Later that night, the knocks came again. 3, just like before. But now, on tape. She played it back slow, over and over. There was a beat between them, too clean to be random, too precise to be weather. It sounded almost like a heartbeat, not mechanical, not wild, like it meant something. Just past midnight, wrapped in a blanket by the window, Grace held the recorder in one hand and a flashlight in the other. The rain had paused. The wind had settled. She stood and stepped outside, bare feet on the cold wooden steps, and walked toward the edge of the tree line. She raised a hand and, almost without thinking, knocked 3 times on the side of the nearest tree. Her knuckles barely made a sound. She lowered her hand, waited. Nothing. Then, just as she turned to go, the answer came. 3 knocks, exactly the same, from somewhere deeper in the woods. Not close, but not far either. She stood frozen, something behind her ribs tightening, not in fear, but in recognition. The forest had heard her, and it had answered. For a moment, nothing moved. Then the breeze picked up again, shaking the wet leaves like applause. Inside, she placed the recorder on the kitchen table and hit stop. The tape inside clicked softly. She didn't play it again. Didn't need to. The sound was in her bones now. She looked down at her hands. They weren't shaking. That night she left the door unlocked. Somewhere, in the darkness between the ridges, something walked slow and steady toward the valley. It left no trail but memory. It made no sound but that rhythm. And though Grace could not name it, she knew a thread had been pulled, and whatever it was at the end of it, it wasn't done. Not yet. She lit a fire, just to keep warm. But part of her hoped that if anything was watching, it would see the light and know. It was welcome. By morning, the air had that quiet stillness it always did after the rain. No birds yet, just mist and the smell of cedar. She opened the front door and stepped out. The wood was damp, the porch slick. A line of dew ran along the railing like a silver snake. On the side of the cabin, just above the window, she noticed something that hadn't been there before. A faint smear of brown, like dried mud, with 5 wide streaks running down, spread like a hand. Too big to be hers, way too big to be anyone's. She reached up, touched the edge of it. It crumbled under her fingers, still damp in the center. It wasn't just answering anymore. It had been here. She sat down on the step, heart thudding slow and even, and whispered into the air without meaning to. "Why me?" There was no reply. But the trees swayed gently, as if listening. She didn't know what she had started, or why it had chosen her. But somewhere in the curve of the canyon, something old had stirred, and Grace Marlowe was no longer alone, not in the way that mattered, not in the way the world had left her. She picked up the recorder again and hit play. The knocks rolled out slow and heavy like drums from another time. She let them play, and when the tape clicked to a stop, she sat in silence, waiting for the next sound, already certain it would come, and that when it did, she would be ready. The road to Elk Bend twisted through tall larch and black cottonwood, their branches scraping at the edges of Grace's windshield like fingers trying to hold her back. The rain had passed but left the earth soggy and dark. pooling in wheel ruts and bleeding slowly into ditches. She drove with the windows cracked just enough to feel the cold, her gloved hands gripping the wheel tight as if the steering column might vanish beneath her fingers. The town sat quiet at the foot of the hills, the kind of place where every porch light flickered the same way and the gas pumps had rust stains like old blood. She parked outside the cafe with its chipped red paint, and windows steamed from the inside. As she stepped through the door, the small bell overhead gave a tired jingle that barely stirred the old man behind the counter. The smell of burnt coffee and fried eggs clung to the linoleum floors like it had been baked into the walls over decades. Franklin Doss sat alone in the corner booth, nursing something in a cracked ceramic mug. He didn't look up right away, just let the spoon circle inside the cup slow, thoughtful. Grace recognized him from a picture that hung in the ranger station back in '81. His beard had been darker then, his eyes a little less hollow. Now he looked like a man made of old rope and smoke. "You're Grace Marlowe," he said. Before she'd even sat down, she nodded. "I heard you knew the canyon." He shrugged, eyes still on his cup. "Knew it before men started carving it up like a deer carcass." Then he looked at her. "What did you hear?" She hesitated. There was something brittle in the way he watched her, like he already knew what she was going to say and didn't want to hear it out loud. "I heard 3 knocks, she said finally. "Twice. Same rhythm, same spot. Then I found blood and a footprint." Franklin exhaled like he'd been holding something in for too long. He reached into the inside pocket of his faded canvas coat and pulled out an old photograph, yellowed at the edges. He laid it flat between them. The image was dark, grainy, barely visible. But once her eyes adjusted, Grace saw it. A tall, shadowy figure, half swallowed by mist, standing near what looked like the edge of a ridge. The eyes reflected faint yellow, like cat eyes caught in headlights. "I took that in '79, he said, "the day before my grandson disappeared." Grace leaned in, careful not to touch the photo. "He got lost?" "He followed something into the trees," Franklin said, voice low. "Said he saw a man with a fur coat walking without shoes. Never came back. They blamed a cougar, but I was there. I saw what he saw, or part of it." She waited. He took another sip, swallowed like it hurt. "There's something in those woods, Grace. Been there longer than we have. I call it the Watcher, and I think it saved my life once." She said nothing. Let the story come. "It was winter," he went on. '81. I was out past the bluff, tracking elk. Snow came down so fast, turned everything white in minutes. I slipped, slid down a ravine, cracked 3 ribs. Couldn't move. Figured that was it for me." He looked out the window, as if the memory was still parked outside. "But something pulled me out. Big hands, rough like bark, lifted me, carried me to a dry spot under a rock shelf, left me wrapped in my own coat. I didn't see its face, just eyes, amber, human-like, not a bear, not a man either." He looked back at her. "When I heard what you heard, I knew it had woken up again." Grace tried to find the line between belief and madness in his voice. She didn't find madness, just grief that had dried into conviction. "I'm not saying you should chase it," Franklin said. "I'm saying you should leave it be." Grace stood slowly, picked up the photo without asking, and turned it toward the light. The figure in it was blurry, stretched by fog and grain, but something about its posture, upright, aware, made her throat tighten. "Can I keep this?" He nodded once. She turned to leave, but he called after her. "If you hear 3 knocks again," he said, voice flat, "don't answer." Outside, the wind had picked up. The trees along the sidewalk shivered in place, as if bracing for something. Grace slid the photograph into the inside pocket of her jacket and got back into the truck. The heater gave one last wheeze before it died completely. The drive back up into Alder Creek felt longer this time, like the road was growing between her and everything familiar. By the time she pulled up to the cabin, the sky had sunk into a dull blue haze. Evening came faster now. The clouds moved like they had weight. She climbed the porch steps and noticed the trap camera mounted by the edge of the roof had been turned, no longer facing the tree line, but toward the road. That wasn't wind. Someone, or something, had moved it. Inside, the cabin was colder than she'd left it. She peeled off her coat, then stopped at the table. The Polaroid Franklin had given her sat there, though she hadn't taken it out. But now there was something new. A smudge of dried mud across the table's edge. 5 wide marks like fingers drawn in with a thick brush. She stepped closer. The smudge was shaped like a hand, but longer, broader, too large for any man. It had been placed, not smeared. Intentionally. She turned toward the door, half expecting something to be standing there. Nothing. Just the ticking of the old wall clock and the groan of wood settling into cold. She didn't sleep that night. Sat by the fire with the Polaroid and the tape recorder on her lap, watching the flames snap and twist like something trying to speak. Sometime past midnight, she heard a thud on the roof. Just one. Then silence. Then 3 knocks. Not close, but not far either. She held her breath, waited, didn't answer. But it didn't matter. She already had. The cabin felt smaller now, like the walls had leaned in while she wasn't looking. Every shadow carried weight. Every sound had teeth. In the morning, she walked out to the truck. Frost clung to the windshield in jagged lines. On the driver's side window, someone had left a mark. 5 thick streaks of dried mud, almost perfectly spaced, palm down. Not a smear. A touch. She didn't wipe it away. Instead, she reached inside and found a slip of paper folded in half on the dashboard. She opened it. The handwriting was rough, but careful. If you hear 3 knocks again, don't answer. It was Franklin's. She knew it in the way you know the edge of your own voice. She stood there a long time, the cold creeping up her sleeves, the trees behind her still as statues. She should have been afraid, should have locked everything down and called someone. But instead, she felt something else. Watched, not hunted, measured, like whatever had come to her door wasn't trying to hurt her, just trying to understand if she was ready. And in a quiet, strange way, she was. She tucked the paper into her coat pocket and looked once more toward the tree line. Nothing moved, but the silence didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like breath being held, like something waiting to see what she'd do next. And somewhere in that silence, far beyond the noise of cars or cities or anything human, something listened. And it remembered. She stepped back into the cabin, shut the door, and locked it once. Not 3 times, just once. And then she waited. The rain had softened the trail into a slow crawl of mud and wet pine needles, each step dragging at Grace's boots like the forest was trying to hold her back. The canopy above Alder Basin hung low and heavy, trapping the morning fog so thick it looked like smoke curling through the trees. The kind of silence you don't trust settled in around her. Not peace, but pause, like something in the woods was holding its breath. She adjusted the strap of her field pack and scanned the path ahead. Headquarters had flagged an illegal campsite in the basin last week. Probably a group of rogue hunters again, the kind that ignored seasonal permits and treated wildlife like target practice. Normally, she'd take a partner on runs like this, but staffing was short, and Grace had stopped waiting for backup a long time ago. Besides, something in her gut told her this wasn't going to be routine. She moved slow, her breath forming quick clouds in the air. The further she walked, the more signs she found. Cans buried under loose moss, broken branches near water sources, boot prints too fresh to be old. She followed them through the thickest part of the woods, where the trees grew too close and the sunlight couldn't quite touch the ground. Then she saw it. A wire snare stretched between 2 low aspens, nearly invisible unless you knew what to look for. Her breath hitched. The trap was new. Metal still shiny, tension perfect. She crouched low to inspect it, pulling out her notepad to mark the location and document it for the file. That's when she heard it. A faint metallic click behind her. Not a twig snap, not a bird. Something mechanical, deliberate. Before she could turn, Something hard cracked against the back of her skull. The forest spun sideways. She hit the ground with her cheek in the mud and eyes staring at pine needles that looked like tiny knives. Hands grabbed her, rough, fast, practiced. Her wrists were bound, then her ankles. Duct tape pulled tight across her mouth. She was lifted, flipped upside down, her jacket sliding up. Cold air scraping against her stomach as her body swung violently and then stopped, hanging from a high limb. Blood surged to her head. Her vision pulsed at the edges. A sharp burn wrapped around her ankle where the cord bit in deep. Above her, 3 faces stared down, blurred through the blood in her eyes. They wore camouflage hoods and black grease paint. One of them had an army surplus jacket with a faded patch. Another chewed a toothpick with slow, quiet focus. "She's early," one of them said. "Didn't think they'd send someone so soon." "Doesn't matter," another replied. "Let her hang. Tonight we bring the devil out." Grace writhed, tried to scream, but the tape held firm. Her heartbeat crashed against her ears. Her vision darkened again. Then they left. Not far, just out of sight. She could hear them moving, hear the clink of tools, the mumble of quiet talk. They were building something, waiting for something, using her like bait. Her shoulder throbbed. Dislocated. Maybe worse. The rope groaned against the weight of her body. Rain began to fall again, thin and steady, sliding down her back, soaking into her clothes until everything felt twice as heavy. Above her, crows circled, calling out in sharp bursts that echoed through the trees like warnings nobody would hear. Time bent. She couldn't tell how long she hung there. Her fingers had gone numb. Her right foot tingled like it might be dying. All she could hear now was water dripping off leaves and the far-off click of something metallic resetting itself again. Then it stopped. All of it. Even the birds. The silence came fast and full. The kind that smothered. The kind that made every nerve go still. Then, from behind the thick curtain of trees, something moved. Not loud, not clumsy. Just there. A shape. Tall. Wide. It stepped forward, slow, deliberate, through the fog. Grace's body twisted slightly in its direction, the rope creaking above her. Her hair hung like vines, blocking most of her sight, but she saw the bulk of it. Too big for a man, too upright for a bear. It didn't speak. It didn't snarl. It didn't even breathe loud. It simply moved toward her. She braced for pain, for teeth, for the end. But it didn't come. Instead, she felt pressure at her ankle, precise, controlled. A sharp sound, then a snap. The wire let go. Her body fell fast, her vision flaring white. But she never hit the ground. Something caught her. A single arm. Strong, steady. It held her for half a breath. Just enough. Then laid her down in the moss, careful, quiet, like a parent lowering a sleeping child. Through the blur of mud and fog, she saw a face. Not animal, not human, but something in between. Amber eyes, wide and alert, flicked over her body once, then vanished back into the trees like it had never been there. She lay there, breath shallow, unsure if what she saw was real. But the wire at her ankle was gone, and the shape had left no footprints. Just silence. And the rope swinging gently above. Distant voices cracked through the trees again. The men were coming back. She rolled, dragged herself behind a fallen log, pain flaring through her hip, her arms burning. But her mouth was free now. The tape lay discarded in the moss like it had been peeled away. She curled into herself, chest rising and falling in short bursts. The forest seemed to lean closer. The men returned. They stood under the tree, staring up. "What the hell?" "She's gone." The one in the jacket kicked at the dirt. "No way. She couldn't have—" Then he turned, looked at the snapped wire, the imprint in the moss. The other 2 stepped back. "You don't think—" One of them raised a rifle, started scanning the tree line. They didn't see her. She was low, still, watching, but something else was watching them. She didn't know where it stood, but she felt it. Out there, just past where their flashlights failed to reach. The forest didn't move, but it wasn't empty. She shut her eyes and waited. When she opened them again, they were gone. No sound of boots, no curses, no gunshots, just the trees, just her breath. She pulled herself up slow, one palm pressed against the wet bark of a pine. Her left leg screamed with every step, but she moved, stumbled forward into the thicket, unsure of where she was headed. Just away, deeper into the dark. Something guided her path, not with light, not with touch, but with timing. Each time she paused, the wind shifted. Each time she leaned toward one trail, the other seemed to vanish. And always just ahead, branches pulled back, stones arranged like steps, until finally she found herself standing in a clearing she didn't recognize. Still, cold, silent, and safe, or at least safer. She collapsed beside a fallen log and let herself breathe. Her shoulder throbbed, her ankle bled, but she was alive, because something had chosen to let her be, and she didn't know why. Not yet. She closed her eyes again and whispered something into the moss. Not thanks, not a prayer, just acknowledgement. She'd been marked now, and nothing in Alder Creek would see her the same way again. Somewhere deeper in the woods, something stirred, and something waited, still watching, still listening, still deciding. The night bled into a pale, shivering dawn. Mist hung low across the creek bed like breath frozen midair, moving only when the wind slipped through the trees. Grace was crawling, one arm useless, hanging limp at her side, her left boot torn, blood soaked through the denim at her thigh, seeping with each dragging motion. Her skin burned with cold and damp, her ribs screamed with every breath. But she was alive, and she wasn't alone. The figure moved ahead of her, not fast, not loud, just steady. It didn't wait. It didn't speak. It simply led, always just far enough to be seen, never close enough to touch. Grace could make out the bulk of its back as it shifted between the trees, taller than any man, shoulders that curved like a boulder carved by time, hair thick and matted, glinting where light found it. The head tilted now and then as if listening, not for her, but for something else, for danger, for signals, for the ones who had strung her up like meat in a tree. Her foot dragged against a stone, and she winced, biting down hard to keep from crying out. The cold had numbed her ankle, but pain flared each time she put weight on it. Her pack was gone, her radio, her map. She had nothing but her body, her instinct, and the one shape guiding her deeper into the timber. The creek beside them ran quick with meltwater, bubbling over polished stones and fallen limbs, cutting a silver path through the woods. The creature, whatever it was, stepped into it without pause, water splashing around its calves. Grace hesitated, then followed. The shock of cold hit her like a slap, but it made her teeth clench and her mind sharpen. She understood then. Footprints vanished in water. Blood washed downstream. She was being protected not just from harm, but from being found. Behind them, somewhere too close, a voice echoed off the trunks. "She was right here," another voice. "Check the slope and the creek." Her breath stuttered. The creature ahead turned slightly, just enough for her to glimpse a profile. Not beast, not quite man. A face hidden in hair, but not lost to it. Skin beneath the fur. A short beard that blended into its chest. And eyes. Amber, like fire under smoke. Focused, thinking, alive. It motioned once, not with a hand, but with a shift of weight. A turn of the head, then moved faster, almost gliding upstream. Grace followed, her foot slipping on moss-covered stone. She caught herself against a rock, pain flashing white across her ribs. She pressed forward. Gunfire cracked once in the distance. She ducked low, slipping deeper into the water, half crawling, half floating. The current tugged at her. The creature ahead paused, turned again, then disappeared around a bend. She pushed harder. Voices again, closer this time. "She can't have gone far. That trail ends here. Maybe she didn't walk. Don't be stupid. Shut up, listen." A beat of silence. Then the sound that split them open. 3 slow knocks, but not from Grace's side of the water, not from where she'd walked. The sound came from the opposite ridge, loud, deliberate, impossible to ignore. The men shouted, scrambling through underbrush, their footfalls crashing through the trees. None of them moved toward her. They moved away, toward what they thought was something else. It wasn't her. It wasn't real. It was a distraction, thrown or echoed or summoned by something that knew how men worked. Grace stumbled forward, out of the creek now, breath catching in her throat. Her clothes clung to her like dead skin. Every step was agony, but she kept her eyes ahead. She saw it again, beyond the tree line, waiting. It moved when she did, led her up a slope, through a thin gap in the rock face, just wide enough for a body. She squeezed through sideways, hands scraping stone, shoulders screaming. Then, dark. A cave. Not deep, not wide, but dry. She collapsed against the wall, heart hammering, lungs clawing at air. The floor was stone and sand, scattered with dry leaves, some of them shaped like fans, others curled like shells. She could smell damp earth and something musky, but not foul. Just old, like bark after rain. The creature didn't come in. It stayed near the entrance, almost hidden by the curve of rock. She didn't speak. She couldn't. So she just watched it. Its silhouette looked carved from mountain. One arm longer than the other, but not twisted, just different. Built for something else. Movement, maybe? Or lifting. Its breathing was slow, measured, not afraid, not tired, present. And then, slowly, it knelt. Not like an animal resting, like a guard waiting. The rain came heavier now, sheets of it pounding the canopy above, sliding down the rock face in thin rivers. Thunder rolled far off, and the world darkened to a deep, stormy blue. Grace sat there, legs folded under her, hand pressed against her ribs. Her shoulder had started to swell. She could barely move it. Her fingers shook as she reached down and touched her ankle. The skin had broken. Dried blood mixed with dirt. She looked around for anything, something to wrap it. But there was nothing. And then, a quiet shift at the cave's mouth. The creature didn't move, but in the space beside it, 2 stones clinked softly together. She blinked, then saw them. 2 small rocks, placed one over the other. Diagonal. She stared at the shape. It wasn't random. She knew that sign. Old trackers used it, a signal. This place is safe. She didn't know how she knew, but she did. Grace touched the stones with her good hand, then leaned back, head resting against the cold wall. She let her eyes close. Only for a minute, but in that minute, everything inside her changed. She no longer thought about how much it hurt, or what would happen if the men found her, or whether she'd freeze to death in the middle of the woods. All she could think about was what it meant, that something had saved her, not for sport, not by accident, but because it wanted her to live. And somewhere in that choice, there was a message, that she mattered, that she'd been seen. When she woke, the light had shifted. Afternoon, maybe. The sky outside was still gray, but the storm had passed. She was alone. The creature was gone, but the marks in the dirt remained. A wide print beside hers. Deep, weighty. She followed them with her eyes to the entrance. There, beside the prints, was another pair, human-sized, not hers. Worn boot soles, narrow gait. The hunters. She sat up fast, panic slicing through her. But they hadn't entered. The ground showed it. They'd come, looked, stood, then left. And next to their prints, drawn in the dirt, were 3 lines. Straight, clean, then blank space. She understood. They'd been warned, and they listened. Grace stood, barely, using the wall for balance. She hobbled to the mouth of the cave, blinked at the brightness. The forest was quiet, still, and for the first time since she'd come to Alder Creek, it felt like it had accepted her. Not just tolerated her, accepted her. Down by the water, the creek ran clean. No blood, no tracks, just current and light. She took a step forward, then another, and somewhere, from far across the ridge, She thought she heard it again. 3 knocks, but this time they sounded like a promise. The radio crackled with static, the kind that fills the silence between men who don't really want to speak. Henry Coulter sat stiff in the front seat of the Forest Service SUV, his fingers tapping slow across the steering wheel, eyes pinned to the tree line rolling past the window like it was watching him back. The sky above Alder Creek had gone bone gray, the kind of color that doesn't change all day. Clouds held low and thick, pressing down on the ridges, on the cabins, on the weight of something still unfinished. He hadn't been up here in over a decade. Not since 1980, not since Alan. The boy had been 10, restless, brave. Too much like his mother, not enough like him. Henry had brought him up here to teach him things a man ought to know, how to follow tracks, how to read the wind, how to listen when everything else goes quiet. And then one morning, he was gone, vanished like fog. They searched for days, found nothing but a boot print near the water and a story Henry couldn't make anyone believe. He told them it was a bear, told himself the same. But the truth lived somewhere else, in the cold silence of trees, in the stillness that came after 3 knocks on a pine. Now he was back, and Grace Marlowe was missing. The report came in just before dawn. She'd been scheduled to check illegal traps in the basin. Routine patrol. No radio contact since the night before. The first search party returned empty. Her truck still parked along the service road. Keys gone, but no sign of her gear. Henry didn't ask questions. He made one call, packed his rifle, and hired 2 men he'd once called enemies. Not forest men, not search and rescue. Hunters, quiet ones. Ones who didn't blink when he mentioned thermal scopes and private air support. The chopper hovered over the basin, blades carving air into thunder. Henry leaned out the side with his headset pressed firm, scanning the treetops. Sweat formed under his collar, even though the wind cut through every layer. He spotted movement along a rise, something dragging behind a stump. "There," he said, pointing. "Put us down on that ridge." The helicopter curved like a slow knife and descended. Grace heard them long before she saw them, the thrum of blades beating through the canyon, the mechanical roar that didn't belong. She stirred from where she lay beneath the twisted branch of a downed cedar, her body curled, aching, damp with dew. Her shoulder throbbed. Her mouth was dry, but her eyes still worked, and what they saw made her heart stumble. The creature, him, was moving, not away, not toward her, but upward, toward the summit. Her backpack slung over one shoulder like it weighed nothing. The emergency beacon, her old field transmitter, was still clipped to the strap. She tried to shout. Her voice broke like glass. He didn't look back. At the top of the ridge, the device shifted, bumped, caught against his side. A red light blinked to life. The signal began to pulse. Henry saw it. "Ping on the beacon," the younger hunter called out. "North ridge, 300 yards. "Take the shot," Henry said. The man hesitated. "We don't know what—" "Take it." The sound split the air in half. One clean shot, then silence. Grace watched as the creature jerked, stumbled. The pack slid off his shoulder and tumbled down the slope. He remained standing. For a moment, then his knees buckled. He didn't cry out. He didn't fall like a man. He folded like something old returning to the earth. Grace screamed. She didn't care who heard. She rose, stumbled, tripped over a root, crawled toward the slope. The sound of boots and shouting drew closer, and Henry Coulter stepped into view. Hair thinner than before, lines deeper, shoulders hunched. But the same, exactly the same. His rifle smoked at the barrel. Grace grabbed a rock and hurled it. It struck the dirt by his feet. "What did you do?" she gasped. He didn't answer. She threw another, missed wide, then lunged for the rifle. They struggled. Her grip found the barrel. His strength held firm, but the look in her eyes made him pause. That's when she reached into the fallen pack and pulled the backup camera. She'd kept it for field footage. Hadn't touched it in weeks, but the battery light still blinked green. She flipped the screen, pressed play. The image was grainy, shaky. But it was there. A boy, Alan, laughing. Blonde hair, green jacket, running through the woods. A figure towering behind him. Not chasing, watching, close, but calm. Then Alan slipped. His foot caught on a root. He tumbled into the creek. The creature moved, fast, not like an animal, like a guardian. It reached him, pulled him to shore, laid him down, then sat beside him, still, waiting. And then, on the edge of the frame, another figure. A man. A rifle. The sound of a shot. The camera tumbled sideways, and the screen went black. Grace looked up. Henry's hands had fallen to his sides. His mouth hung open, the weight of memory catching up with him all at once. "I thought," he whispered. "I thought it was." Grace stepped forward. "You killed the one thing that tried to save your son." He didn't argue, didn't flinch. He just sank to his knees beside the body, hands trembling. The others stood back, silent, uncertain. The wind picked up, cold, bitter, full of pine and old smoke. No one moved. Then, from somewhere in the trees, a sound. Dull. Heavy. 3 knocks. Henry lifted his head. Grace turned slowly. The trees stood still, but something in the air had shifted, as if the forest itself had leaned forward. Not in rage, but in mourning and warning. Grace knelt beside the body, reached toward the fur, still warm. She laid her hand on the chest. A faint tremor met her palm, heartbeat. Weak. Fading. She pressed harder. "Stay with me," she whispered. "Please." But the beat slipped away. Henry didn't speak. He just watched as the last breath left the chest. The amber eyes dimmed, and the sound of the wind took everything else. No one spoke. Not for a long time. Then Henry rose. He walked toward the others, and said only one thing: "I'll answer for this." And he kept walking. Back down the slope. Back toward the world he'd tried to leave behind. Grace stood alone in the clearing. She looked down, and somewhere in her chest something broke. Not like glass, like silence, opening, and filling with everything she'd never been able to say. She looked up toward the trees, and waited, just in case the forest had anything left to give. Rain poured as if the sky itself had been holding its breath too long and finally let go. The mountains blurred behind a curtain of gray, and the wind swept through Alder Creek like it was searching for something. The trees bowed in silence, and water spilled from the ledges of the rocks in quicksilver streams, rushing down into the basin where the forest grieved in its own way. Quiet, still, and watching, Henry knelt beside the body, hands hovering but not touching. His lips parted, but no words came out. For a moment he looked like a boy again, hollow and lost. Grace stood a few feet away, drenched and breathless, her fingers shaking at her sides. She had nothing left to throw. Not her voice, not her strength. Only truth remained now, clinging to them like the storm. Her knees hit the ground beside him. The creature's chest barely moved. A faint rise, then still, then again. Slower. Henry leaned close. The rain slid down his cheeks and jaw, into the beard he'd stopped trimming years ago. His voice cracked into the space between them, barely audible over the downpour. "I killed my boy's savior," he whispered. "All this time." Grace turned her head slowly. She couldn't look at him for long. Her eyes dropped to the chest rising beneath the thick, damp fur. Every breath shallower than the one before. Each one pulling away from the world, little by little. She reached out, pressing her palm gently to the creature's side. It was warm, but barely. No protest, no flinch. As if even now, it allowed her touch. A pulse fluttered beneath her fingers, weak, slipping. She adjusted her hand and began compressions, clumsy and uneven, counting by memory. Her shoulders screamed. Her wrist buckled. But she kept going. The rhythm didn't match her heartbeat. It matched something deeper, something older. It was like calling back a sound that had once echoed in the canyon and could be summoned again if she just kept pressing, just kept believing it wanted to return. Rain hit the dirt in rapid fire. A low boom rolled through the canyon. Thunder or something older. Grace pressed harder, her hands muddy, slick. Her breath caught. She blinked through tears, rain, pain. She said nothing, because words would be too small, too late. Then, quiet. No rise, no fall. The space beneath her hand stilled. And somewhere across the slope, the wind stopped. Henry lowered his head. She sat back slowly, hands falling to her lap. No final cry, no gasping farewell. Just a slow exit into silence. Grace looked up at the sky. Rain blurred the edges of her vision. Then came the sound. 3 deep knocks. Not loud, not close, but clear. Like the mountain itself had spoken. The same rhythm, the same cadence she had answered that first night. 1, 2, 3. Then nothing. Grace looked toward the ridge. Nothing moved. But she knew. They were there. Somewhere in the trees. Listening, waiting, watching. Henry stood, unsteady. He looked around like he was seeing the forest for the first time. Not as land, not as property, not as something to tame, but as a presence. A witness. A memory. He turned to the 2 hunters, who stood frozen just beyond the reach of the trees, weapons lowered, expressions gone pale and stiff. "Tell them what happened," he said. His voice was hoarse but steady now. "Tell the truth." They didn't answer. He took a step forward. "I'll give a full statement, on record, everything." Grace rose beside him. They walked in silence down the slope, the storm easing to a steady drizzle, the worst of it behind them. Each step was heavy, final, and yet unfinished. By the time they reached the base camp, the rangers were already gathering, radios buzzing with scattered words. "Marlowe's alive. Coulter found. Something up the ridge." No one knew yet what to call it. No one said the word. That night, Grace sat in the observation room at the station, the backup camera footage loaded frame by frame across the screen. She replayed the same moments over and over, stopping at the boy's face, frozen in motion, laughter stretched wide, arms flailing mid-run. Then again, where the creature crouched beside him, dripping wet, its hand resting gently on the boy's chest like it was listening for breath. Watching over. She never showed the shot that came next, never let the others see how the boy flinched, how the screen dropped. That part stayed with her. She closed the laptop slowly. Rain tapped against the window like a metronome. She didn't bother changing her clothes. Just sat there, soaked to the skin, listening. Then, from the far end of the station, through 2 closed doors and a hallway full of damp boot prints, came a sound that didn't belong. 3 knocks. Soft, distant, almost imagined. She stood slowly. No one else seemed to hear. She stepped into the hallway. The floor creaked. The air was colder here, stale and unmoving. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, flickering once before holding steady. She followed the sound down the hallway, past the gear lockers, past the lost and found bin, until she reached the last room. The door was cracked open, inside empty. Only a folding chair beside the wall, a drying rack of jackets, and a pile of firewood beside the stove. She turned to leave, then paused. On the floor, 2 stones laid side by side, diagonal. She stared for a long time, then knelt, laid her fingers on the stones, and closed her eyes. It was there again, the knowing. That this wasn't over, that something had been offered and something had been lost, but something else remained. When she returned to her quarters, she found the Polaroid, still tucked between the pages of her field journal, the one Franklin had given her, the shadow in the mist, the eyes like quiet lanterns. She pinned it to the wall, not as evidence, as memory. Outside, the storm had moved on. The air was cold and clean. The pines stood soaked and heavy, their branches dripping like they were grieving. The creek rolled slower now, but steady. Somewhere beyond all that, she knew, the forest was still listening. And whatever lived in it, whatever waited, it wasn't finished. Not yet. In the distance, an owl called out once. Then silence again. But it wasn't empty silence. It was a silence that held space for what comes next. The first snow came early that year, brushing across the ridges of Alder Creek like a memory returning before it was called. The ground didn't hold it yet, just a dusting along the grass, the porch steps, the fallen branches of cedar. But it was enough to quiet everything. The forest moved slower. The sky hung closer. And the silence, once so full of warning, had changed its shape into something gentler. It had been 11 months since the shot rang out on the ridge. Since Henry Coulter laid down his rifle and his anger beside the body of something he'd spent a lifetime misunderstanding. He stood trial that winter, and when asked why he'd returned to the woods, his answer was short. To see if it still remembered me. He didn't fight the sentence, didn't hide what he'd done. Instead, he signed over his land claim, 300 acres stretching along the basin edge, and gave it to Grace Marlowe with only one condition, that she use it for good. She called it Haven Hollow. There was no ceremony, no press, no speeches, just a carved wooden sign posted at the trailhead, hand-painted letters and a small cedar branch tied at the base. The land did the rest. Grace stepped out from the cabin that morning, mug in hand, boots worn to the sole. The air was cold enough to bite the edges of her breath, but she didn't flinch. Her body still ached in the places it always would, shoulder that never healed right, ribs that clicked in the cold. But she moved like she belonged here now, like the pain had become part of the place. The sanctuary had grown in quiet ways. A repurposed barn with 3 stalls for injured elk and orphaned deer. A chicken coop that sat mostly empty except for the old black hen who refused to die. A covered pen for the coyotes that came in half-starved and left reluctant. The woods had rules now, and they were old ones. The kind written without ink. She walked toward the side yard where a few tools were left from the night before. The gate had blown open. Again. She clicked it shut, muttering under her breath. Then she stopped. There, in the frost-covered grass just beyond the fence, stood a mule deer. Left hind leg missing from the knee down. The wound had long scarred over, twisted but healed. It stood on 3 legs, trembling slightly, eyes locked on hers. She didn't move, didn't speak. The deer didn't run. She stepped back slowly, opened the barn door wide. The deer didn't come forward. It just watched. That night, she left the barn gate open, spread hay in the far stall, left a pan of water and a pile of apple slices near the trough. The wind howled. The roof creaked. The snow didn't fall, but threatened from every direction. She turned off the lights and waited. When morning came, the hay was disturbed. The apples gone. In the straw, a faint imprint of a body curled tight against the wall. She found one long black hair stuck to the wood beam. Not from a deer, from something else. She leaned down. Beside the feeding trough, the bandage she'd left wrapped around the apple slices had been returned. But it wasn't as she'd tied it. It had been rewound, tight, deliberate, with strands of grass woven through in a crisscrossed pattern. Neater than her hands could have managed, stronger than twine. She touched it once, then held it close. Someone had helped. Not a someone people believed in, but she did. She turned slowly, looked toward the tree line. Nothing moved. On the highest branch above the chicken coop, something swung lightly in the breeze. She stepped closer, her old ranger badge, tied with cord to the branch. It glinted once in the morning light. She smiled without meaning to, and whispered, "You kept your promise." No one answered. Not out loud, but the silence was full of breath, of presence, the kind you didn't question anymore. She walked back to the cabin, sat on the porch step, and let the sun climb up her face. Behind her, Haven Hollow stirred. The rustle of straw. The soft bleat of a goat she hadn't had the heart to give away. The old hen clucking at shadows. But nothing was louder than the stillness of the trees, and somewhere in that stillness, a watcher remained, no longer hiding, just waiting, and that was enough. For now. The last of the maple leaves clung to the trees like old letters not yet mailed. Haven Hollow had taken on the kind of stillness only late October could bring, where even the wind felt reflective, like it was retracing its steps before winter came to seal them. Grace moved slower these days, not from pain, not from age, but from something deeper, a knowing that life, like the woods, always circled back. The volunteer van rumbled up the old trailhead around noon, tires crunching gravel, echoing off the wide quiet. A dozen middle schoolers spilled out, half of them yawning, the other half immediately distracted by the smell of wet hay and pine needles. They came from Salmon, or maybe Chalice. Grace hadn't asked. They wore mismatched coats and sneakers already caked in mud, but their hands were ready, their voices bright. For one weekend, they were here to help. Grace met them with a clipboard and that quiet smile she used more than words. The teacher, a tired woman with wind-blown hair and caffeine breath, gave her a small nod. "Thank you for taking them," she said. "They need the woods more than they know." Grace simply nodded back. She'd heard that a lot lately. The group split into teams. Some were sent to reinforce the fencing around the goat pen. Others helped clear branches near the creek trail. Grace stayed with the quietest ones, June Parker among them. A 12-year-old with a long black braid and hands that always stayed in her pockets. June didn't speak much, but she listened, watched, paid attention to where Grace pointed, to how she moved around the animals without startling them. By dusk, she'd earned the trust of the old one-legged rooster. No one else had. That evening, the kids ate chili out of mismatched bowls and fought over the last cornbread muffin. Grace sat with them by the fire pit, watching their faces flicker in the orange glow. They laughed, told ghost stories, whispered secrets, and for a moment, everything felt normal. Safe. By the time the last lantern was turned down, clouds had gathered over the basin. Not a storm, just a deep, thick kind of dark. The wind shifted, cooler, like breath on the back of the neck. At 2:18 a.m., Grace woke. The door to the bunkhouse creaked open. The wind had changed. It had that sound to it, the one she hadn't heard in nearly a year. She sat up. A knock? No. A quiet shuffle, then silence. She grabbed her coat, slipped on boots without socks, and stepped into the cold. One of the kids was missing. It took 5 minutes to realize it was June. Her bed was cold. Her backpack still hung on the hook. They searched in threes. Grace led one group toward the creek, her flashlight sweeping through the tall grass, across the ridges where the trees leaned low. No sign of a struggle. No tracks they could follow. Just that silence. That listening silence. Panic crept in like fog. The other kids whispered her name through the dark, some crying now, some too scared to call at all. The teacher clutched her phone, useless in a valley with no signal. Then morning broke. Not bright, not clear, but enough. Grace spotted the hollow first. A break in the ridge she hadn't seen before. She climbed through the underbrush, heart pounding, hands scratched raw. A small cave mouth, dry, shielded from the wind. Inside, June lay curled against the wall, sleeping peacefully. A makeshift blanket of leaves, moss, and soft bark covered her like a nest. Tucked at her side was a small pile of stones arranged in a perfect heart. Above her, the ceiling had been cleared of webs. At the edge of the entrance, 2 lines had been drawn into the dirt. Parallel, even, protective. Grace stepped forward slowly. June stirred, then blinked up at her. Not afraid. "I wasn't lost," she said. "He found me." Grace knelt beside her, brushed a leaf from her hair. "Who?" The girl pointed to the edge of the cave. "He didn't say anything," she whispered. "But I knew." They walked back together. Grace kept glancing over her shoulder, but the path behind them stayed still. By noon, the sun broke through. The kids left with painted signs, memories, and stories they'd never tell their parents. June clutched her moss blanket the whole way home. Grace stayed by the cabin that night, sitting on the porch with her old tape recorder balanced on her lap. She didn't press play, just waited. And when the wind picked up, it carried with it a sound. 3 knocks. Not close, but not far. She looked to the edge of the woods. No figure, no shadow. But on the porch rail sat something she hadn't touched in years. The old cassette from the night she first heard it. She picked it up, hands trembling, slid it in, pressed play. Nothing but 3 knocks, and then quiet. But this time the silence felt full. She closed her eyes. The wind tapped the wooden chimes just once, then twice, then again. She whispered into the dusk. "I hear you, old friend." And somewhere in the stillness, something stayed, watching, holding, keeping its promise. Because kindness doesn't vanish. It echoes, even in the dark. Sometimes the deepest connections are the ones we never fully understand. Carved not from words, not from blood, but from quiet gestures, shared silences, and moments when the heart simply knows. Somewhere between what we fear and what we refuse to see lies a truth that doesn't shout, doesn't demand. It just waits. And sometimes, when we choose to listen, it answers in the most unexpected ways. This story was never about monsters or myths. It wasn't about danger in the woods or the things that move when the lights go out. It was about something much quieter and far more difficult. It was about trust, about the radical act of choosing compassion over fear, of seeing something strange and not pulling away, of offering help, not because we understand, but because we feel, because we recognize in some unspoken part of ourselves that kindness echoes, that mercy doesn't vanish into the trees. It lingers, it protects, it remembers. We live in a world so eager to label and define, to separate what's real from what isn't. But maybe, just maybe, the things we call legend aren't meant to be proven or disproven. Maybe they're meant to remind us of the parts of ourselves we've forgotten, the parts that still believe in grace without reason, in helping without reward, in leaving the world gentler than we found it, because there are forces, quiet, unseen, that watch not to punish, but to protect, that test not our strength, but our softness. And when we meet that test with empathy, with humility, with the smallest act of care, something sacred answers back. It may not come with a face we recognize. It may not speak our language, but it knows us. It hears the knocks we don't mean to send. And sometimes, when we've nearly given up on being seen, it shows us we were never truly alone. The forest remembers, so does the heart. And somewhere out there, in the hush between wind and stone, the echo of kindness still lingers, waiting for someone brave enough or broken enough to listen. If this story moves something in you, some memory, some ache, some quiet belief you thought you'd outgrown, we'd love to hear it. Leave us a comment. Share what stayed with you. And if you'd like to walk deeper into the woods with us again, don't forget to subscribe and follow the channel. Stories like this are only the beginning. Thank you for listening, truly.